Welcome back, all. Dr. JC here. Week 6, part 2. We're going to leave Han China behind. We'll leave the Han Dynasty behind, and we're going to head into Mesoamerica or Central America. Take a peek at a few very advanced civilizations, the Olmec, Maya, Aztec, and Inca, and talk about this pretty cool irrigation system or planting system that Mesoamericans would come up with, known as chinampas. So let's jump into Olmec Mesoamerica first. The Olmec are going to be the first of a series of complex civilizations or advanced civilizations that we talk about. If you look at the map in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you can see that it looks like sort of a burnt orange color at the very center. This is where geographically the Olmec would have been, along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, swampy lowlands about south central Mexico today. The Olmec are remembered for many things. First and foremost, these giant colossal heads, as they're called. If you look at that huge face in the bottom right hand corner of the slide here, imagine a person standing next to that face. An adult individual, say 6 feet tall, would probably meet about the forehead to close to the top of the head of this face. These structures are huge. What's amazing is that these giant pieces of stone, these boulders, were moved here. Now, the back sides of most of these are pretty flat, so clearly we've seen some advanced stonework here, stonemasons and others. But just like the Egyptians in some ways, who putting together King Khufu's pyramid complex, how in how in the world did these guys move these massive boulders and then finish them in these forms? And what's interesting too is we don't really know, cultural anthropologists, ethnocultural historians, and others, not quite sure exactly what they're meant to represent. They do, from an ethnic standpoint, resemble peoples from the region today. So perhaps these were religious leaders, spiritual leaders, political leaders, we're not quite sure. But as it relates to the Olmec, we've got to talk about these colossal heads, as they're called. The other aspect as it relates to Olmec society that I draw attention to briefly is this idea of ritual bloodletting. Now, in most cases, we think of human sacrifice. If we're thinking of the Mesoamerican world, we associate that with the Aztec. Well, understand that it's actually the Olmec that start this spiritual bloodletting first. Again, we're not entirely sure why today. Best guesses are it was probably to appease some type of sun god, or perhaps some other deity. We're just not entirely sure. Thus, to quickly summarize again the Olmec here, I want you to think of them as being located in south central Mexico along the Gulf of Mexico. These are the individuals that are going to first establish a foundation for other civilizations to come behind them. And we have to definitely associate these really cool works of art, these huge pieces of stone known as the colossal heads. Pretty cool folks, to be sure. We'll head into another civilization next, the Mayan. Talk a little bit about a calendar system that these cats put together. Using the map in the upper left-hand corner here, I want you to focus in on that green area throughout that Yucatan Peninsula. That's going to be the homeland of the Maya. While I don't expect everybody's heard of the Maya any more than maybe heard of the Olmec, perhaps you do know a little something about or have heard something about this Mayan calendar system. In fact, it was in the news quite a bit a few years ago. The Mayan had predicted, prognosticated, calculated that we were all going to be dead. Thankfully, at least from my purview, they were wrong. I got more places around the world I want to go, for heaven's sakes. So I'm glad they were wrong. Jokes aside, very interesting people, the Maya here. Agriculturally oriented like the Olmec, to be sure. And while they didn't come up with these great colossal faces, structures, they would build in more urban centers. They tended to be more urban folks. In fact, the larger urban centers at the height of the Mayan Empire were thought to house as many as 50 to 100 plus thousand people. And if you have that many folks, you certainly have to have an elaborate governmental structure. You have to have systems in place to feed individuals, so on and so forth. What we do know about the Mayan as it relates to agricultural, since we were just talking about food, is that they did seem to have two different types of systems in place. They would terrace farm, so they'd use the sides of hills, and those in the lowland areas, they would do what we would call raised fields. It's not quite this Chinampa system that we'll talk about a little bit later, but it's kind of close to that. I want you to think in some sense of almost like raised planting beds for those that might do some herb gardening or gardening of your own. Mayan society was organized from a patriarchal standpoint. This isn't to imply that women, in some sense, were unimportant to Mayan society. They were. But as it relates to leadership positions, positions of power, that was really reserved for the males. And by default, the eldest sons of males. So it was really a hereditary system. Mayans did also practice this ritual of bloodletting or human sacrifice. They did believe in the power of blood. They thought that perhaps blood to the gods was the proper offering, and therefore human sacrifice would be a natural outcrop of that. Again, we associate usually human sacrifice with the Aztec, but it had been going on in civilizations that predated the Aztecs as well. Relating to Mayan spirituality, they did have a concept of a heaven and not so much a hell as it was an underworld. The mortal world was somewhere between the two. There were 13 levels or layers to this heavenly realm. Then you had this mortal realm where we existed today. And then there was this underworld where there were 9 levels there as well. The various points of the compass, the 4 cardinal directions, were hugely important to the Mayan themselves. They associated different deities in different colors with these directions. Evidently, north was white, east was red, south was yellow, west was black. We're still trying to tease out why they used those 4 colors specifically, and perhaps what this overworld and underworld was all about. But we do know that cosmology was really important to the Mayans. That's why they spent so much time looking at the stars, charting the stars, doing astronomy. So pretty interesting in that regard. Supernatural forces were hugely important to the Maya. They were. And shamans were omnipresent within society. While I might like to continue at length here with the ancient Mayans, largely because of the Mesoamerican peoples, I happen to be most attracted to these guys simply because of their cosmology and spirituality. But for reasons of parity, I'll go ahead and summarize at this point. So what do we want to remember about the Maya? Well, certainly their calendar system. The calendar system then ties in some sense into their spirituality. Looking at the stars, charting the stars, trying to figure out one's place in this overworld and underworld. What are you supposed to be and do as a mortal? They are polytheistic. They believe in many gods, many deities, as mentioned along those 4 cardinal directions. They are a patriarchal society. They were urban-based or urban-centered. We still can visit ruins at places like Tikal and Palenque today. And they were an agricultural people too. These were people who believed in farming, whether in the highlands they'd do the terrace farming, and the lowlands they would do these raised beds. All the while, too, practicing this ritual bloodletting. The gods had to drink. The gods had to be appeased, and they liked blood. We'll talk about blood next when we move to the Aztecs, because these cats are pretty good at whacking and stacking and letting blood flow. Prior to getting into the Aztec, we'll do a little geography here. If you look at the map, you see at the center of the map it says the Bay of Campeche there at the center just above the word question. That would have been the Olmec lands. To the right of that is the Yucatan Peninsula. That would have been Mayan civilization. So most of the Aztec lands are going to be further to the west of the Olmec and Maya who preceded them. Prior to talking about Aztec engineering, I want to start talking first about warfare and war fighting and how that related to this ritualistic bloodletting that the Aztecs are well remembered for, and should be, quite frankly, because they will sacrifice people wholesale to appease their sun god, and their sun god liked to drink blood, therefore lots of blood was needed. I happen to like to refer to the Aztec as the Spartans of Mesoamerica. These are the individuals that would go out conquering peoples along their borders to expand their confederation. The Aztec Empire was split into thirds, three large city-states. Tenochtitlan will be one of those. We'll talk about that here briefly in a minute when we talk about engineering. But these are the individual warriors of Mesoamerica. If you think of the hard fighters, to me at least, of Mesoamerica, you have to think of the Aztec. And what better way to appease one's sun god and do bloodletting and ritualistic sacrifice than to go ahead and just grab prisoners of war and put them up there on top of a big structure, slam a piece of obsidian in through their chest, and pull out this bleeding heart. Now look, I'm not trying to get too graphic and gross, but this was the nature of the beast, right? And this is how things occurred. The problem, however, with taking prisoners and making sacrificial lambs out of them, what impact does that have on their enemies? You guessed it. They're not going to surrender anymore. They're not. And this is going to be a problem for the Aztec over time. Now, prior to getting into the agricultural system as it relates to the Aztec, these Chinampas, I want to talk real briefly about the engineering wonder that is Tenochtitlan, their capital city. It's built in an island right in the center of Lake Texcoco. Unbelievable. And one can only wonder what Hernan Cortez and Spanish conquistadors must have thought when they first laid eyes on this city. Now understand, and many of you may know this, it's going to be the Spanish that bring an end to the Aztec. But there really must have been a collective sort of holy crap moment for Cortez and his band of conquistadors when they first got here, because the thought process is we're dealing with some backward folk here. That's not the case. Very advanced peoples. So let's move to the Chinampas next, and then we'll briefly talk about the Inca to close out this lecture. Chinampas were these really cool, elaborate, artificial islands that they created. Because they lived in a tropical area and the soil was always wet, it was hard to get seeds to germinate, and those that did and grew into plants, the plants would develop root rot and die. Therefore, they had to find a way to effectively grow large amounts of food, large amounts of crops. They'll do that with this Chinampa system. The Chinampa system I want you to think of as almost like a large planting bed. These really were artificial islands, as mentioned here. They would use green wood for their main posts, and the reason we're using green wood is because it does not rot. You would take existing plant materials or fibers, vines, and weave them into this wall structure called wattle to connect the green wood posts. And then in order to fill the soil in this box that was created, you just use the nutrient-rich stream bed or lake bed. And in essence, what you had then was always very nutrient-rich soil. At the same time you were dredging the lake bed, you were creating canals to be able to use as systems of transport. Therefore, if the soil ever started to look like it was running a little bit loose on nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, the NPK that people that are in an agricultural game would know, you just go ahead and do what? Take the top part off, throw it on one side, dig up more stream bed, put it on the other. It was a ridiculously cool agricultural system, and it worked splendidly well. In fact, they still use it today. I want to close out the lecture here, and we'll just talk about the Inca briefly. This isn't to give them short shrift, but simply because they are going to go by the wayside, much like the Aztec will as well, because of the Spanish. The Spanish will come in and ultimately conquer these people as they will the Aztec. But there's some certain aspects I want you to associate or know about the Inca that are very important. The key points really I want you to associate with the Inca are their engineering abilities. These are master stonemasons, master road builders. These individuals will fit stone, fit rock, put it into place in an area known for plate tectonics, lots of seismic activity, and hundreds of years after these road systems and elaborate structures were built, without the use of mortar, mind you, these stones are still fit into place as we see them and can walk on them today. How far this civilization would have been able to grow remains a big what if. They run into Europeans with better firepower, and it's going to cut their civilization short.